Okay, in the last video we were talking about what it means to be a system. And now we want to go on to find out how we can use what we've learned about systems to think about the world, and especially to think about the environment and the environmental problems that we have started to grapple with in this class. I call the application of our understanding of systems to environmental problems systems thinking. The first thing you should think about with systems thinking is that it is holistic. In other words, not only do we need to understand the parts of the system, but we must look at the entire system. So we need to take the system apart, reductionist thinking, but we also need the opposite of that, which is holistic thinking, in thinking about the entire system. We also need to look at the interconnections in the system. A change in one part of the system will ripple through the other parts. For example, through feedback loops. And sometimes systems aren't just connected cyclically, but they're connected more like a web. Traditionally, humans have often used linear thinking to approach problems. And that's the idea that a single cause creates a single effect. And so people have often just said, oh, here's our problem, let's deal with this, and haven't thought about system-wide effects that will happen as a result of it. So I would ask you, can you see why linear thinking could cause problems in a system? I think you guys are already sophisticated enough in your systems ideas to see why that could be a problem. And I'll give you an example of that coming up on the next slide. So system thinking wants to understand the behavior over time of the system. It wants to understand the effect of the system, or if it's a human design system, the purpose. In the case of natural systems, they're not human designed. They have no purpose, but they do have effects. Systems thinking strives to understand how the components produce the effect. Systems thinking looks for interconnections, interdependence, which I didn't put up here, but should also be included, of the components. Looks at the stability of the system, in other words, the homeostatic conditions produced by the system. And then finally, the conditions under which the system will operate in its current state, where it will completely break down, where we'll have a failure of the system, or where it will jump to a new state. Once again, I didn't put this on the slide, but it's thoroughly possible that systems will jump from state to state when external conditions change. Another important point to remember is that systems thinking looks for, and I said expects here, but looks for unintended consequences, because systems respond to a change in them, and we know that it's not just a linear A affects B, but then what else does A affect, and then what does B affect? So systems thinkers look for other consequences. It's not a surprise when new consequences unfold. And I want to give you an example of it, a real life example of the failure not to use systems thinking. I'm going to highlight the failure of pesticides in many cases, in this case insecticides. Now, here's the problem. The problem is farmers had pest insects destroying their crops. I have a pest. And so linear thinking says, well, that's a simple problem. Let's just kill the insect. So let's develop something that will kill the insects and kill them all. And that's a poison. The solution for that is going to be putting an insecticide or a pesticide on the crop. And the result is that in the short term, the insecticides often work, but in the long term, many times that insect pest gets worse, or new pests appear, despite the continued use of the insecticide. So let's look at what happened in that case. And I'm going to give you the short version of the explanation. Pest insects exist in an ecosystem, and in that ecosystem they compete with other insects, and they are preyed upon by predatory insects. So over the long run, the pesticides affected the competitors and predators as much or more than the original pest. So in other words, if the predators are gone, those that survive are free of predators, so they're going to grow even faster. Another thing is that insects can evolve. And therefore, many pest insects quickly evolve resistance to the pesticide. So that's why insects don't work as a long-term strategy. The systems thinking approach came up with this idea called integrated pest management, IPM. And IPM uses non-chemical practices to reduce the pest insect population. So for example, corn rootworm is responsible for somewhere around 10 to 20% of the insecticides sprayed in the United States. And if you do not grow corn in the same field for more than 2 years in a row, you will not have a sizable rootworm population. So simply by moving your corn from one field to another, you can avoid all that pesticide spray. And so you come up with practices that reduce the pest insect population, and then you only use pesticides in dire situations as a measure of last resort. This slide is a very shortened version of a very long story for which there are entire courses in grad school, and people study integrated pest management. So let us remind ourselves of the big systems on Earth, and then let's talk about one potential way that systems thinking can be used to think about environmental problems. The big systems on Earth, right? We've already seen the rock cycle as part of the geosphere. But some other important cycles are, of course, the water system, which I've been calling the hydrosphere, but the water system, which is the movement of the water around the planet. In the atmosphere, that's where weather is created, and the average weather conditions lead us to climatic conditions. So the air system brings us weather and climate. And we also have the ecosystem, how life interacts with the other systems and changes them while also being constrained by them and being changed by the other systems. Our task in this course will be to understand the role that these systems play in maintaining a hospitable planetary environment, in maintaining an environment that is good for life, or we should say, in maintaining environmental homeostasis. Now, I want to introduce you at this point to a person who had a lot to say about systems thinking in the environment. And his name was Barry Commoner. There's a picture of him when he was on the cover of Time magazine in 1970, February 2nd, 1970. And you'll notice that it says up there, Environment, Nixon's New Issue. Imagine that, a conservative Republican politician who was pro-environment. Barry Commoner was a chemist, trained as a chemist, and later became an ecologist. And he wrote many books, and the one that was very influential at the time was called The Closing Circle, which he wrote in the early 1970s, and it was about the environmental crisis. It was specifically about environmental systems and how to think about them, and it really was made in the spirit of educating the general public, the belief being that if you just educate the general public will be wise enough to vote the right people in, and the environmental crisis will start to be ameliorated. And you could see around this time, the EPA was formed, the Clean Water Act passed, the Endangered Species Act passed, Clean Air Act passed. There was a lot of improvement, at least at the surface level, in thinking about the environment. In this issue of Time magazine, Barry Commoner was called the Paul Revere of ecology, riding through the streets, warning us of the imminent environmental crisis. And Time also said he had probably done more than any other U.S. scientist to speak out and awaken a sense of urgency about the declining quality of life. Commoner died in 2012 at the age of 95. I may have you read one of his obituaries at some point. An amazing guy. Wrote several other incredible books. And he demonstrated that environmental problems resulted from the fact that the environment is a system, and humans were acting in ways that caused the system to respond poorly, and in ways that showed that the environment was deteriorating and maybe threatening the future of humanity itself, although Commoner was never one to forecast imminent crises. So he emphasized systems thinking, and he developed 4 laws that explain some of the root causes of environmental problems, as well as offered guidance for how to solve them, in that if you can see that this is the problem, you can now look for solutions. Now that you all understand systems, these laws will make a lot of sense to you. So here they are. Commoner's first law of ecology. Everything is connected to everything else. Well, because you understand systems, and because human beings live within an established ecosystem on Earth, we didn't invent it ourselves, this probably seems like a pretty logical law to you. There's a famous medieval poet who wrote, "Thou canst not pick a flower without troubling a star." The same sort of intuitive understanding that everything is connected. And one of the consequences of everything being connected is that in a system, you can never only do one thing. When you do something in that system, in an ecosystem, there will be other inadvertent immediate consequences. For example, spraying pesticides kills not only the pests, but also the predators of the pest. So you can't just do one thing. You spray the pests, but you do other things as well. In addition, as the original action ripples through the systems, there will be further consequences. For example, the loss of predators means that populations of other insects that weren't originally a pest can now grow large enough so that new insects become pests. And we have seen this especially in cotton, where the number of cotton pests after the advent of heavy insecticide spraying jumped from 2 to 5 to 12 to 15. And eventually there were so many insect pests on cotton that cotton just could not be grown in certain areas. And if the system is an adaptive system, which means it changes in response to new actions, and we call these actions perturbations. That's a word that I've been using. I think you should understand. Look it up if you don't know it. Pause the video now and look it up. Then there may be long-term consequences. For example, the original pest evolves immunity to the pesticide. It's no longer poisoned by it. So whereas a pesticide might have worked in a dire situation at the beginning, like when the pest was really threatening the crop forever, and you could have used it that year to save a crop, now it doesn't work at all. And we've seen this, for example, the current loss of the effectiveness of antibiotics is the same kind of thing. If the disturbance is too great in an ecosystem, the ecosystems may change to a new state or may collapse, as we've already said. And that's an important concept as well for you to get. Okay, that's the first law. Everything is connected to everything else. Commoner's second law. Everything must go somewhere. Once again, as a systems thinker, you must think this is a pretty self-evident statement. Things are material objects. We live in the material world. And so when you throw something away, it goes somewhere. As Commoner like to say, there is no way to throw things. The only exception to that is some scatterbrained ideas to actually put all of our garbage on a spaceship and jettison it into space far enough from the reach of gravity that it will never fall back onto Earth. I'll let you figure out why that's a particularly lunatic idea. Commoner posited this because one of his biggest accomplishments, and the thing that really catapulted him to fame, was scientifically demonstrating that radioactive atoms produced in nuclear bomb testing were being incorporated into the bones of children. They suspected this was true, and what they did was they got parents all over the country to send the baby teeth of children into a lab where they tested them for radioactive strontium. I believe strontium is in the same column of the periodic table as calcium, and therefore it behaves just like calcium, gets deposited in bones. And when Commoner showed that strontium, which was created by fallout from nuclear bomb testing, was showing up in the baby teeth of children, people got really upset and demanded action. And we got the nuclear testing treaty passed in relatively short order, despite the fact that the powers that be did not want that to happen. So this law was postulated to address the issue of waste that is simply discarded into the environment. When waste or molecules are put into places where they don't normally occur, they can have big repercussions on the environment, on the ecosystem, including the human ecology and the human ecosystem. In this course, we're going to see many, many examples of this, especially with man-made or synthetic. When I say synthetic, what I mean about that is they are man-made, made by human beings, don't occur naturally. So that is Commoner's second law. Everything must go somewhere. There is no way to throw things. Be careful what you put in the trash can. Commoner's third law of ecology. And this was perhaps his most controversial law. Nature knows best. I think it's controversial because people with vested interests wanted to attack Commoner, and so they purposely misinterpreted the intent of this law. And Commoner made this law despite knowing that there were predators, disease, naturally occurring toxins, other harmful things that were on Earth before humans existed. He's not saying that nature can't kill you, and he's not trying to romanticize the Paleolithic period and the paleo diet. He wouldn't have been a fan. And he's not trying to talk about how ancient human beings lived in harmony with nature or any of that kind of thing. But what he was saying was, as a systems thinker, can you guess why Commoner was suspicious of things that the environment wasn't familiar with? Can you guess what Commoner was getting at here? If you want, pause the video, take your guess, write it down, and we'll see. Here was his argument. The ecosystems on Earth are really old, and they've been functioning and evolving by adaptation for hundreds of millions of years. The colonization of land is about 450 million years old. Thus, novel intervention in the ecosystem brought about by humans is often going to be harmful because nature has not experienced this. The natural world has not experienced this. And we'll go into more detail on that. So he was suspicious for that reason. And he proposed this law because humans are creating a huge number of synthetic chemicals. Once again, those are man-made chemicals, human-made, that did not exist on Earth before humans and that are currently produced. The number is mind-boggling, the tonnage is mind-boggling, and the fact that they're now in everything as contaminants is also mind-boggling. His argument was that these are more likely to be harmful and have far-reaching consequences than non-synthetic chemicals, because naturally produced chemicals have lived in the environment for hundreds of millions of years. Thus, he argues we should be suspicious of them until they are proven safe. And this is the idea of the precautionary principle. We will talk about that in the environmental health unit more. We will see the consequences of not taking this approach during the course over and over again. The chemical industry, as you could expect, hates this. Finally, Commoner's fourth law of ecology. And his fourth law of ecology, he must have been very happy with himself. There is no such thing as a free lunch. You may have heard this expression before because this is the famous adage of conservative economists. Conservative economists love to point out that the money used for government spending has consequences, and the implication is could be used better if it were being used by private investors. So Commoner was really sticking it to the conservative economists. He was saying, you see, there's no such thing as a free lunch, because these are the type of economists who typically support corporations who, in Commoner's view, have done most of the environmental damage. And so he was using their own words against them to drive home the point that human actions within an ecosystem have real costs that somebody must pay. So this law really tickles me personally, and you can imagine that people got really riled up about it. You can probably understand this as a systems thinker. For example, anything extracted from an ecosystem either has to be replaced or a price will be paid. So I didn't finish that next sentence, and I don't quite remember what I was going to say, so I'll try to add something in the future. But let me just say that if there's an ecological consequence to an action, somewhere down the line, someone will be not affected. Just one example of that is currently farmers use tons and tons of fertilizer, some of which washes down the Mississippi River. And when it gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it creates a dead zone every summer in which no fish can live, the size of New Jersey. And if you haven't been there, New Jersey's a small state, but it's still a lot of land area. And that's cost hundreds of millions of dollars in economic loss to the fishermen of the Gulf. So that's the no free lunch of farmers using fertilizer. Thus, this course can be thought of as the study of the cost of free lunch that has been enjoyed by modern industry. We're going to be studying that free lunch. That is the end of today's video, but let me point the direction in which we're going to be going. And that is the resources and services supplied by the Earth's systems, humans are entirely dependent on now and into the future. I'm going to make the argument, and I want you to see if you agree, because this is a case of an ethical judgment being made, that humans cannot invent a future, nor would we want to invent a future, where all of the resources and services are human-made. If you've ever seen the movie Blade Runner, I think you know that. So that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed this talk, and please write down questions that you have, and we'll discuss them in class next time.